Hi there, this is Not Invented Here, a show about tech, product development and business, and I'm your host, Dima Malenko. The other day I was listening to a recent episode of podcast App Stories. By the way, if you haven't heard this podcast yet, you should definitely check it out. It's by Federico Bettici and John Voorhees, and they were discussing the state of non-native apps. Well, they did so in application to Apple platforms, Mac and iOS. And in that episode, they were discussing what is the place or what's the current state of applications which are developed with the non-native toolkit. In particular, in this day and age, it most often means application developed using web technologies as opposed to using native toolchain, for example, Swift and Objective-C on iOS and Java on Android and stuff like that. But the peculiar story which John told there was about the application called Todoist. This is actually a to-do app that I use myself. And there John noticed that this application being non-native, being web-based application running, well, mimicking as a native application on Mac OS, it doesn't follow the conventions of the platform, being that in order to create a new task in the application, you have to press Q. The shortcut for new item in the app is Q, as opposed to CMD-N, as you would expect in a Mac application. And that observation really reignited my thinking around the question of to what extent should an application embrace platform guidelines and conventions? How important is that application follows those conventions, and how beneficial can be not to follow those conventions? And this story and this thinking actually brings me back to the times of Windows 95 in late 90s, where I guess it may not be the first time it happened, but this is actually something that I first got in touch with. Fairly strict and pronounced platform guidelines for how the UI elements should look like, and to the extent that the icons in different applications also looked exactly the same because they were provided by the system. And at that time, when I first saw that, I thought that that was really a good idea, because I, as a user, could translate my knowledge of different icons or actions from one application to another. And only later I kind of changed, I came around on that question, because it turned out, at least in my experience, that more often than not, those past experiences with one application can be misleading when you deal with a different application. And because even if the icon looks the same, the meaning of the action denoted by this icon can be different. And it is quite often the case, I found in my experience. And with the exception to maybe very basic system type of actions, like creating a new file with a blank sheet icon, or copying and pasting something from clipboard, even if the icon was exactly the same in two apps, the actions denoted by those icons were different, and that actually takes more time to process for me as a user, to identify what I'm trying to do here and remember and recognize which application I'm in and what this actually means. But those times have gone, right? We are not using Windows 95 anymore. And even with the more recent versions of Windows, I could not say that I had the same feeling dealing with different applications. They follow the guidelines, but they still try to bring something of their own into UI and somehow visually differentiate it, which is a good thing. But then came Android with material design. And here I also have to make a remark that I'm not using Android full time. And my experience with Android is using it on a tablet, which I do quite often, but that's not my primary way of doing things. So my exposure to Android and applications on Android may be limited, but still, I got a feeling that after Android apps and major app developers on Android switched in some form of fashion to material design, it became harder for me to distinguish between the applications just by the looks of them, because all of them have hamburger menus. All of them have the plus button in the bottom right for creating new items. But when I'm looking at the app, it takes me extra time to process and realize which application I'm dealing with right now and what that plus icon would actually do when I click it. This may come from my limited exposure to Android, but the idea is the same. To what extent should an application embrace platform guidelines? Should the application stay true to itself, or should the application stay true to the platform where it is running? And I think this is a very, very interesting question. And trying to answer that question, I will start with an extreme example of an application which is not an application. Those are computer games, right? So each and every game has its own UI, it has its own look and feel, and has its own way of doing things. And that's fine for games. Games almost never, like AAA games, like never follow platform guidelines. Instead of trying to look like the system on which the game is running, they try to immerse user into the universe of the game, into the game world, and we all accept that. We accept that when you get a new game, there will be a little bit of a learning curve in order to understand the design language of that particular game and figure out how to do things and what do different elements of the UI mean there. But still, there are some conventions which games follow, like using WASD for navigation and stuff like that. But the UI and look and feel and design are completely different, and games always try to stay true to themselves. They have no respect to platforms on which they're running. What about regular applications that you and I would use in our work lives? Although I've started with an example of Windows 95, it makes sense to bring us back to 2017, where we are, when you are rarely using an application which is a thing of itself. More often than not, you will be using an application which is a cross-platform application or service. But the key thing is that you would interact with this application on different devices and in different settings. And that changes the calculation. For example, in the case of Todoist, if I'm not mistaken, they started as a web-based app before they developed quote-unquote native versions for different platforms. They started as a web app. And there, in the web application, you technically cannot use CMDN or Control N as a shortcut for creating new item. Because when you are running a web application in a browser, that shortcut will be intercepted by the browser itself, and it will, I guess, create new window. CMDT will create a new tab and CMDN will create a new window. I never use that and that's why it took me a while to figure this out. But so technically, when you start there, you cannot use this shortcut and you have to be creative and come up with something else. And they come up with Q. And then when the time came to developing or creating, maybe developing is a bit of a strong word here, but creating a native version of the application running on Mac, as a developer, you would be posed the question, so what do we do here? Do we keep the shortcut of Q, which users using our web version which was the only thing they could interact with us before, and they are used to pressing Q to add a new task? Or should we switch that to CMD-N when we are on Mac and Control-N when we are on Windows? And that is an interesting question. And I would think that they did the right thing of keeping the shortcut of Q, but you can see that there are two options possible, and which one to choose depends on the relative importance for the application of the experience with the app itself on a different platform, and the experience with the platform and translating that experience into dealing with this particular application. And shortcuts are an interesting thing, because in another application that I use called Spark, it's a mail client developed by Riddle. This is truly honest to God native Mac application. And they, in their settings, have an option to activate shortcuts used by Gmail. And that, again, illustrates the importance of bringing experience with the application from one platform to different platform, and how that can play a role into how you resolve this conundrum of whether following platform guidelines closely and maybe even religiously, or instead paying respect to platform guidelines and staying true to the way your application looks like and behaves like across all the platforms where it is available. And when we talk about the design and user and the experience of the application and the design language used in the application, there are two opposing forces, or maybe not necessarily opposing, but two goals that you cannot necessarily satisfy at the same time. First is translating experience from an application on a different platform. So if you were using Todoist on the web, should you be able to translate that experience into the native Mac version as a user? Should you be able to, and is it possible to do so? And how important is it for your application? On the other hand, we have an experience in dealing with platform and learning the way things are done and conventions of interacting with the application on a particular platform and device, and translating that and using that in dealing with the new application you have installed on your computer. And you, in most cases, you cannot have both of them, because if you had an application which is true to the platform on iOS and create a version of this application for Android which is true for Android, you would hardly be able to give users an affordance of translating their experience from iOS version to Android, because the design language of two systems is fairly different, and users will have to find their way around new version of the app, like not from zero, not from ground up, but close to that. To solve this conundrum and find a balance for a particular application or a particular service available across several platforms, I think there is one key question that needs to be answered, and that is, can your user get proficient with your application or service? Is he using an application in a way that with time makes him proficient with this application? And I would say that most of productivity type of applications or pro type of apps where users do something to get a result with their hands and minds and brains, the answer to those questions is yes. Like Todoist, you can become very proficient with this app with shortcuts and knowing patterns for creating tasks and such. And if you can get proficient with the application, then I think being able to get your experience with an application on one one platform and using that experience with the same application on different platform is very important. And then you should respect platform guidelines, but not follow them religiously. Make sure that experience with your application is similar and can be translated across all the platforms where the application is available. On the other hand, if users do not really get proficient with your application, if it is a utility type of application which is used only occasionally, and with each use, user almost always will sort of rediscover the app because the memories of previous occasions of dealing with this app are almost gone, then you should stay true to the platform because it will help the user who comes with almost set of fresh eyes to your application. And if he will see there some familiar icons and familiar layouts and things like that, it will help them find what they wanted to find and do what they wanted to do, and move on. Move on and forget about your application until next time they need to do something with it. An example of the first case where there can be proficiency with the app is, say, Adobe Lightroom, which is, professional application, which I also use to process photos I take with my DSLR. And as time goes, I become more proficient and more engaged and more invested into that application. And when Adobe came up with the mobile version of the Lightroom, it made all the sense in the world to make sure that experience, layouts and visual elements and ways of doing things in mobile version of Lightroom are the same or close to what I get in the desktop version, because I, as a user, would not want to rediscover the app. I want to use and build on my experience and my knowledge of this application. As I was preparing for this episode, I also went on the internet to look what others think about this question, and I found a great article which in particular compares iOS and Android versions of different apps and also divides them sort of in two camps of those who keep their app branding and look and feel across platforms and those who are trying to stay as close to platform guidelines as possible. And there they came to the conclusion that, for example, Dropbox tries to stay as native to the platform as possible, and that makes sense because with you don't spend your time with Dropbox. You use it to find a file, maybe to upload a file, to sync a file to your different device, and move on to another app in editing that file. So Dropbox plays only a utilitarian role. You get into the app and get out of the app as quickly as possible. And there you don't want to make users spend their mental energy of figuring out how to do things with this application. And there it makes all the sense for the application to stay as close to platform as possible, because the time we spend with those applications are not long, and it is highly probable that by the next time I will do something with Dropbox, the memories or the muscle memory of doing something with this application will go away, and using familiar patterns and layouts and metaphors and conventions for the particular platform will help me get my thing done faster. So that's it. In order to decide whether you should follow, well, overall, you should follow platform guidelines if you are not developing a game, but the degree to which you follow those guidelines, in my mind, would depend on the answer to the question of whether the user can get proficient with your application. And if the answer is yes, and that's a realistic yes, not a wishful thinking, I wish our users were pro users, using our application day in and day out. But if realistically, as users spend more time with your application, if they are more efficient in accomplishing their tasks with that application, then I would say that you should try to preserve your look and feel and experience of the application itself across platforms, and have platform guidelines only as a second priority. But if the application is an application that is only used occasionally, then by all means follow the platform guidelines. You will help your users a lot. And I guess that's it for today. Let me know what you think about following platform guidelines. You can find me in Twitter. I'm at dmalenko. You can find me on Sonar1 and leave a comment next to this episode. You can also find me on Facebook. Until the next episode, see you on the web. Bye bye.